Shut up and sit down.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Fight for Liberty show. Today, we have a really awesome show set up for you guys, so I'm just going to skip all the dilly-dallying and get right into it. We have Rabbi Litvin and Dave Smith here to discuss some very controversial topics that have been going on in the liberty movement lately. So like I said, we're just gonna jump right into it here. How's it going, guys?
Very good. Thank you, Rabbi Litvin, and thank you, David, for hosting us.
Thank God. Happy to be here.
All right. So I feel like everybody that's watching this knows what we're talking about here. There was a very controversial tweet that went out from the Kentucky LP official Twitter account, and a lot of people have very differing views on whether or not it should have been sent in general and how the reaction should have been handled and what it actually stood for and what it means. So we're going to have an open, good faith dialogue about this. This is not a debate. It's not, we're not coming in here with our preconceived ideas, or at least I'm not. And I'm excited to hear your guys' opinions and actually delve into this.
Sure. Well, who would you like me to start, or would the rabbi like to go first?
Well, I guess let's start out by just kind of getting your guys' original interpretation of the tweet, like how you guys first reacted to it. And let's start out with the rabbi.
So sure, the tweet was supposedly about, the focus was supposed to be, which ended up not being the focus, the proposed vaccine passports, which have been suggested. The idea, when the tweet came out, no one really had any idea what the idea was going to be. Government officials have backtracked on exactly what it's going to look like. So they were tweeting with very little knowledge of what this idea was, just a name. And the Libertarian Party of Kentucky chose to make a comparison to the badges that the Nazis forced Jews to wear on pain of death during the Holocaust, which those badges have a long history of oppression and segregating Jews from others. There were multiple issues with this comparison that we can get into over the long conversation, but for a lot of Jews, the basic issue was that they felt engaged in Holocaust minimalization. So the idea that, number one, whether or not your views on this vaccine are, and there are, of course, a myriad of views on it, taking it or not taking it, which results in getting the passport or not getting the passport, does remain a choice. It's a choice that affects your health. It's a choice that affects your liberty, certainly, but it does affect the choice. The Nazi government held that anyone who had a Jewish grandparent, which at that time, 3 out of 4 of those people, no one in the Jewish world considered Jewish. Only the Nazis considered them Jewish, was a Jew. So regardless of what choices they made, regardless of what their point of view was, they were sectioned off. And second of all, as this idea is just being proposed, and again, when they wrote this, they were completely guessing to expect what it's going to be, how it's going to be applied, etc., to apply it to a situation where we know how it was used. It was used to separate with the plan to exterminate the Jews of Europe. Long before the badges were introduced, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. He was already speaking about plans to exterminate the Jews of Europe. So a star that was used with the plan of the wholesale slaughter of 6 million people, and actually more people, they only succeeded in killing 6 million people, is both ahistorical, the comparison doesn't hold up, and amoral to a lot of people. What's more troubling is both the Libertarian Party of Kentucky and a lot of the people defending the tweet have a long history of engaging in either straight up Holocaust denial or Holocaust minimalization, etc. So earlier that day, for example, the Libertarian Party of Kentucky tweeted, then took down a post about who controls America with a quote from Mayor Ansel Rothschild. Mayor Ansel Rothschild died hundreds of years ago. The quote was fake. And any research would have told them that generally when someone uses Rothschild quotes without researching them, it's a sign that they have certain views. Rothschild is commonly used in anti-Semitic conspiracies, the idea that the Rothschilds run the world, etc. Last year, actually almost exactly a year ago, the LP in Kentucky put out a torrent of tweets comparing various aspects at the beginning of the shutdown to the Holocaust, including voting on a spending bill, which had nothing to do with COVID, mask mandates, and the like. And they were reached out to by the Jewish community, and their views were expressed. Mm-hmm. So there's certainly an insensitivity to writing it that way. And as a party that is seeking to make an impact in Kentucky specifically, and has had more success in the last few years than they've had in a long time before that, I think it's counterproductive to the party. I think it's counterproductive to the point they want to make, because while the Libertarian Party Twitter account celebrated the fact that the tweet went viral, it didn't lead to an open discussion on the issue. It merely led to an open discussion on Holocaust revisionism. Mm-hmm. And I think it does more to offend people than it does to advance either their cause or the topic they were discussing.
Yeah. So the one thing that I'll definitely agree on is that the conversation was nowhere near what it should have been or what it was intended to be by any of the good actors in the conversation. Yeah, you're completely right. We weren't talking about a vaccine passport or any threats to our liberties in real time right now. It turned into a 3-day conversation about the Holocaust instead, which really wasn't necessarily the point of.
And I would note that Justin Amash wrote a very similar tweet, mm-hmm. but thinking it out, he chose to use the word dystopian rather than the word than a reference to the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. You could certainly call the Holocaust dystopian, but by opening it up and not referencing a particular moment in history, not drawing all these comparisons, rather using a more open term, his tweet sparked a much more open conversation on the issue he was bringing up, rather than what this sparked.
Sure. So, Dave, what was your original kind of reaction?
Well, just to very quickly, because this is the first time me and Rabbi Litvin are meeting each other. So just to kind of disclaim my biases coming into this whole situation, I'll just quickly say that I am a radical libertarian who passionately believes in human liberty and absolutely despises the COVID regime that's been installed over the last year. And I think it's a truly dangerous, terrifying place that our country is in, and the amount of basic liberties that have been taken away from the American people is troubling, to say the least. I'm also a Jew, and my grandfather was a survivor of Nazi Germany, the only member of my family to survive. He escaped Nazi Germany in 1938. Everybody else died at the hands of the Nazis, and he just by luck or faith, I suppose, depending on how you look at it, was able to get out in 1938. And if he hadn't, I would not be here. And so I have a bias against the lockdowns and the COVID regime. I also have a bias against Nazis or taking the Holocaust lightly. I also am a stand-up comedian who's been hanging out in nightclubs for the last 15 years and has heard every wildly offensive joke in the world, and I have a pretty thick skin when it comes to that stuff. So just saying that in the background of all the the biases that I bring in to the discussion. So I was very appalled and concerned about the proposals, some of the proposals for this COVID vaccine, which has already gone into effect in New York City. And, I also, like Justin Amash, I went on a tweet storm about this and did not make any Holocaust comparisons. I actually compared it at one point to the Chinese social credit system because that just seemed like a more reasonable comparison to me. That was just the one that jumped out to my mind. Also because China has already implemented a COVID vaccine passport themselves. So I was I don't know that I completely agree that this completely distracted from the conversation. I have seen more of a conversation, certainly in the libertarian community, about these COVID vaccine passports than I have about just about any topic recently. So I think, and ultimately I would like to get back to that topic, which is part of the reason why I wanted to try to clear the air here. I agree with the rabbi that, look, anytime you make a comparison to the Holocaust, it's never, it's never going to be as bad as the Holocaust. I mean, God help us, because that it's basically the worst thing that's ever happened, or up there, right up there. And so anything that you're comparing to the Holocaust is always going to fall a little bit short. I think it's absolutely fair to say that Holocaust comparisons are a little bit intellectually lazy, and they can be sloppy. That being said, I would disagree with the characterization that this tweet was minimizing the Holocaust. I think that to me, the problem with using a term like that is that you're using a term that would more accurately apply to someone saying the Holocaust wasn't that big of a deal in some sense. That to me would be minimizing the Holocaust. I think the intent of this tweet was pretty clearly to maximize the danger of the COVID vaccine passports. Now, again, we can say that missed the mark. Of course, this is not the same thing as Jews being forced to wear a gold star in the lead up to the genocide of millions and millions of Jews. Again, though, there's kind of different sides to this, right? Like, there is something that you could say that when people compare things to the Holocaust, which, let's get real, that's kind of just part of American culture, in large part because the Nazis were such an outrageously evil regime, in large part because the biggest war in the history of the world was fought against them. People use the term grammar Nazis. Seinfeld had an episode about the soup Nazi. This is something that is in our culture. And so, of course, whenever there's something that you want to call awful and authoritarian and totalitarian, it's one of the first things that comes to people's minds. And I think that there is actually an argument. Again, I'm not completely sold on this one way or the other, but perhaps you could make an argument that that's not the worst thing in the world, that we live with a very alive sense that we hold this regime up to be the worst regime ever. And if anything even starts to smell like it, we want to call that out and blast that, because we never want to go down that path again. So I understand the argument that, okay, you don't want to compare everything to the Holocaust. I also understand the argument that it's good to never forget. It's good. Listen, Rabbi Litvin, I'm sure that you heard over the last year comparisons to the Holocaust, as I certainly did, when Jews were being rounded up, arrested in New York City, in New Jersey, for the crime of going to synagogue. There's been an awful lot of demonizing of communities that don't want to get vaccinated in these times. And that ends up, at least one of those communities, ends up being religious Jews. Now, of course, Governor Murphy in New Jersey arresting 20 Jews for going to synagogue is not it's not what the Nazis did. But I also do understand where there's this instinct to right away be like, hey, wait a minute. The state is arresting Jews for going to synagogue. We have a very strong allergy to anything going in that direction. So I don't necessarily think it's all bad. And I certainly don't think that the spirit of the Libertarian Party of Kentucky's tweet was anything anti-Semitic or downplaying the Holocaust. That's generally my take on it.
Yeah, I missed the tweet when it happened. The original shitstorm. I didn't see Seth Rogen's tweet on it, or I was not a part of that at all. I slept in that day, and then I was recording episodes all afternoon, and so I just missed all of it. I saw that my group chats were going off, and people complaining about that Twitter account. But honestly, I just assumed that it was in reference to one of the many other bad tweets that they had sent out in the last week that I had witnessed. They're not the greatest Twitter account. There's a reason they only have 4,000 followers. And, they were attacking a 15-year-old BLM supporter the other day. That got screenshotted and shared around some Facebook groups. And so I just assumed that it was a continuation of that stuff. When I finally actually caught on to what was going on and that they were being anti-Semitic, I was like, oh gosh, okay. And then I finally actually read the tweet at 11, actually it was after midnight that night. I was on Reed Coverdale's show, and Will's Fite actually read it out on the show. It was the first time I heard what was written. And I was just like, okay, this, again, I agree with both of you. Yeah, completely intellectually lazy. But by far from like there was no malice in that tweet from my original perspective. I think again, I agree that it's intellectually lazy. I agree that downplaying the Holocaust is a bad thing. I agree that that people should stop using the word Nazi so much. But I don't think that it's with any kind of malice towards a race of people.
So I specifically said that the argument was ahistorical and amoral. I didn't say anti-Semitic, although in effect, when you minimize the Holocaust, you are being anti-Semitic. To several of Dave's points, number one, it is certainly not the same as straight up Holocaust denial, which many in the Libertarian Party have flirted with. I know you yourself have interviewed Nick Fuentes, who has engaged heavily in Holocaust denial. There are several others who are becoming prominent in the Libertarian movement who have also either flirted or outright engaged in Holocaust denial. It's not the same as that. But when you say that a measure that you have no idea what it's going to look like yet, like the vaccine passport or a mask mandate, is equal to what the Holocaust did, and when you compare two things, you're equating them. You're saying there's something similar among them without explaining that in any way. So there are many ways to use Holocaust denial, Holocaust comparisons. Generally, the proper way to do that is an intellectual argument over 2 pages. I think it is never a good idea to use a Holocaust comparison in 240 characters on Twitter. It's not only
that's a fair point.
It's not only intellectually lazy, and again, part of what made it offensive was the fact that it seems like a 15-year-old is running that account himself. That they have been offensive several times in the past. Also, a great deal of the backlash to those who shared perspectives from the vast majority of the Jewish community were just completely flooded with anti-Semitic jokes, anti-Semitic statements, threats, etc. So I personally was called capo, which are Jews who served in Nazi camps. I was told there'll be more pogroms against Jews, which is an organized government attack on Jews, and saw a vast amount of anti-Semitism, along with just a great deal of other immature tweets that looked like they were written by 15-year-olds. I don't think that there were many in the mainstream Jewish community who used Holocaust comparisons to describe Murphy and far more Cuomo and de Blasio's anti-Semitism over the last year. I think the majority of comparisons were to Soviet Russia rather than to the Holocaust, which is a much more apt comparison. As you said, with a comparison towards China is a much more apt comparison. Are there voices in the Jewish community that have compared it to the Holocaust? Sure, but I don't think the Jewish community is responsible for every member's voices, as I don't think any community is responsible for voices on the fringe. But in general, the mainstream Jewish community did not make that comparison in any form I've seen. And I would say that that there is a growing use of anti-Semitism in politics. There's a big difference between Seinfeld, who does have problematic issues in his show, and using Soup Nazi as a joke, and a party that wants to be taken seriously, that is part of a growing political movement, using it in a political argument. I think there's a big difference between those two things. Well, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So I agree that there's a big difference, but respectfully, I think that making a comparison is not the same as equating two things to each other. Making a comparison and it wasn't even a direct comparison. It was just referencing the yellow stars. Now, again, I'm not saying that this was perfectly accurate, but just for the sake of accuracy in this discussion, it's not as if the Kentucky LP said this policy is the same as the Holocaust. So I just want to be clear about that. And I agree that you can't, just as you said, just because there were some people in the Jewish community who may make comparisons to the Holocaust, well, you certainly can't, criticize all Jews. You and me are not responsible for what some other random person says, because we're all individuals. I would also say the same is true for the Libertarian movement and the Libertarian Party. And the idea that people within the party are flirting with Holocaust denial, I will just tell you that I have not seen any of that. I mean, I think that there are a couple very random examples of people who are not in the Libertarian Party, But that is not something that is present in the Libertarian Party at all. In fact, I've never come across a single member of the Libertarian Party who has engaged in Holocaust denial. So that's just, at least been my experience as a member of the party for years and as a member of the Liberty Movement for about a little over a decade now.
So as a member of the Liberty Movement, you have enthusiastically interviewed Richard Spencer, Nick Fuentes, Hastam, what's his name?
I'm sorry?
I don't remember the name of the third guy I was going to say. The second name is the Christian Lord. I don't remember what his first name was.
Hotep.
There you go.
Yes.
Hotep. And others who have either openly or, so those three have openly engaged in anti-Semitism. Two of them have openly engaged in Holocaust denial. So I don't think it's fair to say that there are not voices being extremely supported and platformed in the Libertarian Party, including members of the Libertarian Party, who do espouse Holocaust denial.
Well, okay.
I think it's a fact.
But none of the people you
today.
mentioned, hold on, but none of the people you mentioned are members of the Libertarian Party, which is why I specifically said that. I don't know if I'd say I enthusiastically interviewed them or I forget what your other term there was, but yes, I've had interviews with some people who certainly have hostilities toward Jewish people. I personally do not think that it is the worst thing for there to be a conversation between a Jewish person and people who have some anti-Semitic views. In fact, I think that you could make a very strong argument that it's more productive and better that maybe there are some communications there. I certainly myself have never agreed with any anti-Semitic views. I am a Jewish person. I love Jewish people. I love my family. I don't know. Shout out to Beth Elohim, Park Slope, Brooklyn. That's where I was bar mitzvahed. So again, I just think that we're kind of conflating a lot of different things here, and that I mean we can kind of take them one at a time if you'd like to. But I don't think, as I've said, I've never. I can't say it doesn't exist, but I've never heard of an LP member deny the Holocaust. I've also never had anyone deny the Holocaust to me or on my show, in which case I would have been quite happy to debate them on it. I believe it's, if not the most, right up there with the most well-documented genocide in human history. And so I think it's I don't think there's any argument there, but if someone were to want to argue that with me, I'd be more than happy to. I mean, talking to people who have views, even some views that you really disagree with, I think not only is there not anything wrong with that, but I actually think it's probably our best hope. And if you look at anybody who's had the most success, people like Daryl Davis, I believe is his name. Did I get that wrong? But people like who have had the most success in dissuading people of some of their bad ideas are the ones who are willing to have conversations with them.
So I would say I've listened to Daryl Davis's conversations with white supremacists, and I listened to various libertarian radio hosts, including your interviews with white supremacists, and the mood is extremely different in what they confront, what they let slide, and what they agree with. So I don't know if the Daryl Davis comparison is exactly fair.
Well, I'm not suggesting that I am the same as him, but from my understanding of his arguments or his explanation, I did watch one of his like TED Talk videos, and he basically said that what he would do is befriend these people, have conversations with them, treat them like people, treat them respectfully, and that over years. It was, there was gradual progress that was made. So I don't know. I mean, no, I'm not saying I'm exactly the same as him. I'm certainly not. He's had a lot more success. I wish I had some hoods in my collection like he does. But I was just making the point that having conversations and being respectful with people, even people who might have some views that are abhorrent, I don't think that in itself is a bad thing.
Yeah, I definitely want to echo that a little bit, because I hear the names that you're bringing up, Rabbi, and to echo Dave, like none of them are actual members of the Libertarian Party. So to echo what you said about how every group has some fringe people, and you can't attack the larger group based off of a couple of people's takes. I think what you said about the Jewish people maybe making Holocaust comparisons during COVID, what you said about that, you need to then take and apply to the Libertarian Party, because it's the same thing. you're taking a couple of fringe people's bad takes on Twitter and saying that the liberty movement or the Libertarian Party is engaging in anti-Semitism or friendly to anti-Semitism, when as a whole we are very much not friendly to any of that. And I'm part of the New York City party, where literally 2/3 of our membership is Jewish. We have to plan our entire schedule around that. We can't have meetings on Fridays or Saturdays because most of the people in the state party and the city party wouldn't be able to show up. So, when I'm working in a party that literally has to move their schedule completely around the schedule of Sabbat and different holidays, because we have such a large Jewish membership, to then get called anti-Semitic as a movement or as a party just doesn't make sense to me.
So I would say that hosting someone within days of them marching, chanting "Jews will not replace us," and not confronting them on them marching and saying "Jews will not replace us" seems to not have an issue with that. Hosting someone like Richard Spencer, who has called for violence against Jews, and not confronting him on that. Hosting someone like Nick Fuentes, who has said the Holocaust never happened, that the ovens, and to say that his jokes about the ovens not happening are funny, etc. That seems to be a at least implicit respect for their point of view, and I don't think that is showed by most of the mainstream parties. Now, the mainstream parties today also use Holocaust comparisons far too often, and is just as offensive. I would note that someone from my community made a comment that I thought was inappropriate when responding to a different tweet many found offensive from the Libertarian Party north of New Hampshire, and I immediately called them out on it as well. I work to be so the only reason I knew about it to call her out on it was she tweeted the word Kentucky, and I anything Jewish in Kentucky on Twitter I see. So I mentioned that her comparison was equally inappropriate. Now, I do think there are many of those who are making the attacks right now, who want to attack the argument being made or want to attack the Libertarian Party, and wouldn't attack the same argument made by someone in either the Republican or Democrat Party, depending where they're coming from. But I also think that to reject that this is a view, or to say it's only a fringe view, when quite a few members of the party are not only agreeing with this, retweeting it, etc. So I don't know if you two would consider yourselves prominent members of the party or not, or prominent voices in the libertarian movement or not, but there certainly were prominent voices in the libertarian movement who are sharing this. And further, you have an official party account tweeting Rothschild quotes and Yellow Star references, and there's no condemnation from anyone. That while I appreciate the argument, I disagree with the mode they use to make it. I think that shows an implicit agreement with the arguments they're making, which again, the arguments they're making, according to the vast majority of the Jewish community, would be defined as Holocaust minimalization, which is anti-Semitic.
So I'm curious where you're getting the no condemnation part from, because our chair condemned it, a bunch of people in the party condemned that tweet, to the point where that was most of my Twitter feed the day of, was people condemning this tweet. And I mean, yeah, I had plenty of people that I followed that were also supportive of the tweet itself, because we're having this conversation, because I think there's some middle ground on the tweet itself. People could misunderstand. I think a lot of people didn't understand what you're talking about, and I would have retweeted that without a second thought had I seen it before the conversation, just because I thought it was a hot take, catchy, not everybody has.
So again, the reason it's a hot, catchy take is it's an emotional argument built on the back of 6 million Jews.
Right.
That's why it's a hot, catchy take.
And I agree with what you're saying there, and I agree that people, especially myself, as not a Jew, I don't always think through those thought processes. I'm sure there are a whole bunch of things that you could probably find in my Twitter feed that are offensive to some group of people, if not multiple groups of people, either out of ignorance or sometimes intent. But so I think that to compare people retweeting this tweet to being supportive of anti-Semitism as a whole, because like you said, it's that tweet you in the beginning of this episode said wasn't necessarily anti-Semitic. You said that it was
in intent.
Right. So I think the people sharing or retweeting it was probably also not anti-Semitic in intent. But the people condemning it, which was a lot of people, and including the most prominent member of the party, the chairman of the Libertarian Party, as well as a whole bunch of other state accounts, a whole bunch of other prominent people,
So
did
the
actually
silence I was
push
referring
back.
to was specifically within Kentucky. I do appreciate there were many national voices that condemned it. So I will adjust that. I wasn't talking about national voices at that point. I would say that many of the comments on the tweet, especially in response to other people, were blatantly anti-Semitic.
Well, okay. If I could just respond to like a few things, because again, I think there's a lot of things that are being thrown out here, especially, and they're very different issues. But the guests that I've had on my podcast in the past, just because you brought that up a couple of times, I will say this: my podcast, I didn't realize we were going to be discussing this, but I'm happy to, if you'd like to. I have had controversial guests on my podcasts from all different areas of the political spectrum. And if you look throughout my podcast, this is pretty much how I treat all of them. I show them respect. I joke around. I'm a comedian. I get into some of the issues. There is nobody who listens to my podcast and doesn't know exactly where I stand. I've done about a dozen episodes over the years, an hour and a half long episodes on the alt-right, on anti-Semitism, on the history. I've talked about the history of my family. I've talked about the history of the Jews. I mean, a lot of this stuff. It's very, very clear where I stand. The Mises Caucus, who you were critical of on Twitter, is named after Ludwig von Mises, who was a brilliant Jewish economist, who also, by the way, fled from the Nazis. My intellectual heroes are disproportionately Jewish, and so you can pick out moments of some of the people I've had and say, you get this impression. I don't think anybody who is a regular listener of my show gets any impression other than what I actually believe in, which is that I am passionately support human liberty. As far as the stuff that you're saying, I mean, if you're going to look, you said at one point that if we want to be taken seriously as a political party, you can't make these type of comparisons. The issue with that is that, as you acknowledged, all the serious political parties, the other two, engage in the same sort of behavior all the time. That's not to justify it when they do it, and I appreciate your consistency in calling it out across the board. But I mean, just the other day, Joe Biden said that the voter ID restrictions in Georgia were worse than Jim Crow, which seems like an unfair comparison to me. It is interesting to me, though, that you're calling these things anti-Semitic. I suppose not in intent, but in effect. I believe is what you said. I mean, I think somebody could criticize you for minimizing anti-Semitism the same way you're being critical of minimizing the Holocaust. I mean, if you're going to say that anti-Semitism means somebody who hates Jewish people, but you're going to throw that term around when there are real people who hate Jews out there, but we're going to throw that term around about somebody who's clearly not saying anything even remotely close to I hate Jewish people. That's not what they're saying with the tweet. What they're saying is the Holocaust was horrible, and oh my God, are we going down this path? Now, I understand this wasn't it wasn't a 10-page paper with an intellectual argument behind it. It's a tweet. That's the nature of Twitter. But I think you could just as accurately be criticized for minimizing anti-Semitism by throwing out the accusation over that tweet.
So I think the Jewish community as a whole has a right to define what anti-Semitism is, and they have. And I think that specifically, as David said a little earlier, that it wasn't a direct Holocaust comparison. It was a flippant joke about the Holocaust. So number one, especially if you're officially writing something as the voice of a party, making flippant jokes about the Holocaust is a bad idea. But minimizing the Holocaust as a whole, which very much is what this does, comparing a yellow star that was worn throughout parts of history, not just during the Holocaust, but specifically was adopted during the Holocaust to mark the people that they planned to kill, to a floated idea of a vaccine passport, is minimizing what the yellow star was. Doing it in a flippant way and doubling down on it in an extremely aggressive way only exacerbates the problem. So I don't think it's me saying that Holocaust minimization is anti-Semitism, is anti-Semitic in effect. And by the way, I didn't say it's never anti-Semitic in intent. I said in this case, I don't know if it was anti-Semitic in intent. I would say that having tweeted a blatantly anti-Semitic tweet about Rothschild hours earlier does bring into question the thought process of the person doing tweeting. But certainly an intent, which is minimizing the Holocaust, is anti-Semitic. It's not my view. It's the vast majority of the Jewish community's view.
Well, okay. I mean, I don't know if it's the vast majority. Like, I haven't seen polling data over the vast majority of the Jewish community, but I'm a part of the Jewish community, as are you, and I think that's just an appeal to the majority. I mean, I think that anybody, myself, you, or anyone who's not a Jew can make an argument over what anti-Semitism is or isn't, and whether you're a Jew or not, or even if the majority of the Jewish people feel a certain way, that doesn't just inherently mean they're right because they feel that way. I'm curious. I mean, again, I don't think you really responded to my to my point that I made about, that this could be considered minimizing as much as you're saying that this tweet was guilty of it. But, it strikes me that you said that other Jews had more often made comparisons to the Soviet treatment of Jewish people or of dissidents. And I made a comparison to the Chinese government, and all of those comparisons seem to be okay. So couldn't you, I mean, obviously to a lesser degree, it wasn't, although I guess the Soviets killed a whole lot of people. But couldn't you also say that, like, all of these comparisons are guilty by the same logic of minimizing or being in effect anti-Chinese or whatever? I mean, like, if I compared it to the social credit system in China, clearly the oppression from the Chinese government toward the regular Chinese people, particularly certain groups within China, is worse than what's happening in America right now. But that didn't seem to generate any outrage. So is there an inconsistency there?
If you're being intellectually honest, no, I don't think there is. I think the intent of the Soviet government, for example, in their oppression of Jews, which did end up with the murder of millions of Jews, was not to wipe out the Jewish people. It was to force them to conform to society. So comparing a mayor or governor forcing Jews by force to conform with society in ways that were absolutely anti-Semitic, that comparison does make sense. Is it a perfect comparison? No. The Soviet regime was much harsher. And thank God Cuomo was too distracted by the other crimes he was committing to fully focus on attacking the Jewish community. So I don't think the comparison holds up 100%, but the base of the comparison does. In order to force Jews to conform, he used bully tactics, he forced their arm with police, etc. The comparison between a vaccine passport, which the most extreme thing I've seen with the vaccine passport is Canada's current policy, which I'm not exactly sure the exact on, but sounds extreme. So I haven't heard their exact policy. I just heard the sound bites from Justin. But to compare just putting out that word in America with, again, a system that was planned to exterminate all the Jews in the world, exterminate your grandfather, exterminate mine, I think that base of the comparison doesn't hold up. And when you compare the two, and you cannot in any logical way lift the vaccine passport to meet the intent of the Holocaust, you have to lower the Holocaust argument to meet the intent of the vaccine passport for the comparison to hold up. That's how a logical comparison works. So you'd have to engage in Holocaust denial arguments like Hitler never intended to kill the Jews, it just happened, it wasn't a plan originally, it wasn't 6 million Jews, there weren't gas chambers, etc. You cannot both acknowledge what the Holocaust was and make that logical argument.
Well, okay, but so I disagree with the last part there. I don't think that logic is sound. So if you're going to say that you're making a comparison, say, for example, between the Soviet Union, who you're saying were killing people because they wouldn't conform to society, whereas with the Nazis, there's a distinction there because it was targeted extermination of a group of people. And I agree with you on that distinction, although both are pretty horrible. But yes, I agree with you. But I agree with you. There is a distinction there. But the essence of that is that there is something that you can compare to another thing, even though it might be much worse. There is a comparison there, and so I think
there's a comparison in intent specifically.
Right. Okay. But regardless of whether it's a comparison in intent or not, I mean, a comparison could be about any two things that are, have some form of similarity. If we're going to say that you can compare two things, even if one is far worse than the other, if there's something there that's a similarity that somehow justifies it, like the comparison between people being marked and unmarked is something. Now, I understand there's a very important difference that you pointed out. There's a very important difference that I guess theoretically you can get the shot. And whereas a Jew who was labeled a Jew, even as you pointed out, those not considered Jews in Nazi Germany, there is nothing they could do. Again, I'm not saying there are.
I would
no
also say I haven't seen anyone argue that what we should do with the people who don't have the vaccine card is kill them, which was the argument when they put stars on Jews. These are people who have to be eradicated from our society. So there's a major difference there in intent.
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree with you that, again, it's my argument here is not that this is the same as the Holocaust. So yes, of course. Now, I do think there might be an area to split the difference a little bit with you there, where certainly Hitler had plans and talked about exterminating the Jews years before even taking power. However, it's not necessarily clear that actually moving forward with the final solution was already a guarantee in 1939 when the stars first started going on, or I think it was the armbands first started going on. I mean, certainly in hindsight, that was Hitler's plan all along, but things, there was a series of events that led to this happening ultimately.
So logistically, it certainly wasn't worked out, and it would have been fair at that point to say, I don't think that's where this is going.
Right.
In 2021, to say that in 1938 and 1939 there wasn't a plan to exterminate the Jews, I think is ahistorical.
No, okay, so I completely agree with you. I'm just saying, certainly there were people who had those plans already. It's just that this did happen in a long series of steps, right? Like, it's not as if, as you well know, it's not as if Hitler came to power and said, we're exterminating all the Jews immediately. He had these plans, and then there was a series of steps.
Correct, but we're not discussing this over coffee in Berlin in 1938. We do know what his plan was now.
I'm not saying, obviously, we know what happened. That's not the point.
So when you say the vaccine passports are like step 6 in Hitler's plan, you're acknowledging it's step 6 of 22, and 22 is murder everyone with that symbol on them.
No, but to the point that you're making, just hear me out when I'm saying this. We're not having coffee in 1939 in Berlin, but we are virtually having coffee in 2021 in the United States of America. So by your same logic, now I don't expect us to go become a genocidal regime. Dear God, I hope not. But to your point, what they were getting at is going, hey, this is a step in a very dangerous series of steps. And I really think the sad thing about all of this distraction is that that's the really crucial point that I wanted to talk about. That was the whole point of this Twitter push, is that, hey, forget just for a second all of the Holocaust comparison stuff. The argument is this is a really scary step in a bunch of scary steps that we're in the middle of here, where the governors of the states have openly repealed the Bill of Rights over the last year, and that people have been taken away personal liberties that just a year and a half ago would have been unimaginable to be taken away in America. And now we're talking about setting up a virtual caste system where there is one group of Americans who have freedoms and one group of Americans who don't. And the proposals that have been out there have been very basic freedoms being taken away from people. We're not just talking about you can't leave the country or something like that. We're talking about going grocery shopping, going to sporting events, going to work, going to see family. So in the midst of this, and just so I hope you can understand my perspective here, I think what we're talking about here is this freaking scary. This is a really dangerous time for the country. So is the LP of Kentucky guilty of hyperbole? Perhaps. However, I understand the spirit of saying no, I want to blow the loudest alarm that I can blow about this, to be like, guys, this is something out of a really horrific regime would do. And I think that, back to the point that I made at the beginning, again, I'm not saying it's not sloppy or somewhat intellectually lazy, but what does the average American think of when they think of the worst regime ever? What's the easiest example that comes to mind? And obviously, the answer is are the Nazis. And okay, again, as I said in the beginning, and I don't think this has really been addressed, there is a double-edged sword to that from the Jewish perspective, where yes, okay, you could argue, as you have, that is somehow minimizing what happened in the Holocaust. But you could also argue on the other side that it's kind of not the worst thing in the world that the Nazis still, to this day, so many decades later, still carry with it this weight of the evil regime. And I got to say, I think that there is probably something positive about that. There's something positive about the fact that, this is the spirit of never forget. In my opinion, it's two-sided. It's number one, never forget what, families like mine went through and how horrific that was. And also never forget that the other side were people too. And that somehow society can be poisoned and go so bad that people are capable of committing these atrocities to innocent women and children. The idea that people who are made out of the same genetic stuff that all of us are made out of are capable of doing such evil things. And so that's the point that I think I was getting at before. It's not that Hitler didn't have plans. I mean, Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf about gassing Jews. It's not that he didn't have plans. It's that through a series of step by step of dehumanization, stripping of rights, alienation, ghettoizing, putting in concentration camps, and ultimately into death camps, they were able to take a society and make them something out of a novel level of evil that you couldn't imagine real people are capable of being. So anyway, I think that what the attempt here to me is very obviously, the message of that tweet was not to say hey, the Holocaust wasn't that bad. Hey, we don't like Jewish people. The message of that tweet was to sound an alarm about the moment that we are living in. So I hope that, whatever comes out of this conversation, and I really do very much appreciate you taking the time, Rabbi, to speak with me. And I appreciate you, David, for hosting this. But I hope whatever comes out of this conversation, we could at least maybe come to the common understanding that it's what they were trying to do, maybe didn't do it as successfully as could have been done, but what I'm trying to do, what Justin Amash is trying to do, is sound an alarm about us creeping toward a totalitarian society. And I do think that my family's history plays a large role in my allergy to government totalitarianism. That's not to say that this is exactly the same situation. I will never go through what my grandfather went through. Or at least
Yeah, fingers crossed on that.
Yeah,
one.
I mean, hopefully, things would have to be much, 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 much worse for me to go through that. However, I do think that understanding what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany does give one an appropriate allergy to government totalitarianism.
So one of the fundamental books of Jewish philosophy is the Tanya. The Tanya begins that before a soul comes down to this world, God makes the soul swear to be righteous and not to be wicked, and that even if the entire world considers you righteous, you should be in your own eyes as wicked. And the author of the Tanya immediately asks a question: why should one consider themselves wicked? He says there's two problems to considering yourself wicked. The first is either you'll say, it's terrible that I'm wicked and get depressed, or you'll say, I'm wicked, it's no big deal. So for example, during the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton used the term deplorable to insult a majority of Trump supporters. A large portion of Trump supporters took that title and said, yeah, I'm a deplorable. I'm fine with that term. If this is what you think a deplorable is, I'm proud to be a deplorable. I would hate to see someone use the term Nazi and be like, you know what? Yeah, if that's what a Nazi is, I'm proud to be a Nazi.
Yes, but Rabbi, that's exactly what's happening in this country. That precisely what you just said is what's happening, is that when people are so demonized by the establishment, and then the establishment also goes, and by the way, the worst thing you can ever be is a Nazi, eventually they push some angry young men to go, you know what, then I'm a Nazi.
So
And
going
this
back
is,
to
by
the
way, hold
Tanya's
on, let me just,
argument,
if you don't mind, if I could just finish this point real quick, because this really is the essence of what I was always doing when I was interviewing those alt-right guys, is that I was trying to, and I think my audience knew this at the time, although some people who really don't like me act like they don't, but what I always thought was the most powerful way to talk to those guys was to take that outrage that was their fuel and to just strip it away. And to just go like, yeah, okay, I'm not outraged. Let's actually have a conversation about ideas, because I don't believe that their ideas can stand up. And so I got messages from a ton of people who were flirting with alt-right ideas after the Richard Spencer interview. And they told me, you totally exposed that guy, because I just calmly asked him what he was prepared to do to achieve his ethno-state. And he wouldn't answer. I mean, you told me that you watched the interview. I don't know if you caught this part of it, but he just kept dodging it. And I kept going, oh, that's kind of a dodge. That's kind of not being like, oh my God, I'm so outraged, because that's where they get their fuel from. But my thing was just like, okay, but what are you prepared to do to these people? What are you prepared? And he would never give me a straight answer on it. He would always just go, well, when times get murky, things happen and stuff like that. So I really think you hit the nail on the head right there. There is something very, very dangerous about provoking, people on the fringes of society and calling them all of these names unnecessarily, because eventually they just start to own it. In the same way that if you end up calling a bunch of young black men thugs, and they're given nothing by society, and you keep labeling them that way, eventually they're like, yeah, you know what, fuck it, I'm a thug. And like, this is a very dangerous game, and I think it is happening all around us. So I'm sorry, I know you.
Well, I don't think your thug analogy holds up. I would disagree with it heavily, but that's a bit of a separate subject.
Okay.
Going back to what we were discussing, so just as you said, when you call someone a Nazi, the term loses its value. They're able to identify with it. When you constantly use Holocaust comparisons, you do one of two things, like the example that Tanya said. Either you say, let me look at the history of the Holocaust. Okay, this is not as bad as the Holocaust, so I don't need to fight the vaccine passport, which is, I don't think, what your intention is. Or, I understand the vaccine passport, the Holocaust is equal to this, then why is the Holocaust held up as the most evil thing ever? If I'm able to defeat this vaccine passport, or if the vaccine passport doesn't come to be carried out, or if I see the vaccine passport doesn't go to the next level, that's probably what the Holocaust was also. And when people talk about the memory of the Holocaust and talk about the memory of Never Forget, it's the same as this issue, which is a terrible issue, but comparable to many governments across the world. I don't think the Soviet Republic or the Chinese government is equatable to what the Nazis were trying to accomplish. Again, I think their goals, their intent was completely different, even if many of their tools were similar. So
sure.
I think,
Rabbi, I think you're 100%
I agree.
right.
Finish for a second. When you use comparison repeatedly, the term uses all value. And I just want to return to something you said earlier, when you alleged, accused, whatever word you want to use, that I'm minimizing anti-Semitism. Again, that is not a personal view I have. The vast majority of Jewish organizations in this country have come together. They've had a discussion about this, like Jews love to do. They've debated it. And there is a definition of anti-Semitism, which was written by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which the Jewish community has accepted. All the major organizations with representing tens of thousands of Jews across the United States have accepted that. The last three administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have accepted that. Another dozen countries and several states have accepted that as
Rabbi,
a fair definition. Let me just finish of what anti-Semitism is. And Holocaust minimization is recognized by them as anti-Semitic. So is it as terrible as what de Blasio is letting going on right now in Brooklyn, where Jews are being stabbed in the streets? No, but it is a form of anti-Semitism, and it also needs to be combated. I listen to you pitch your political philosophy. There's a lot of wisdom there. I'd love for that to be the conversation. But as a Jewish leader who has the legacy of Never Forget, I have a responsibility to speak out when Holocaust minimization happens. I didn't want to be a part of this conversation. I was called to be a part of this conversation. So I'd love to get back to that. I think a great way to get back to that would be for the tweet that the Libertarian Party of Kentucky sent out to be worded a little bit differently and to refocus the conversation rather than intentionally doubling down. I think if a lot of the commenters on people's objections would say, you're missing the point of the tweet, rather than there'll be more pogroms, you're a capo, or just flashing repeated pictures of yellow stars at Jews, I think, again, the conversation would have been a lot different. And I think it's just as dangerous, by the way, when you mentioned this on Twitter, so I looked it up, Bill Wells' comments on Trump's policies, AOC's comments on kids on the border, etc. And I think when more and more prominent politicians, so I don't know if the Libertarian Party of Kentucky is on that level yet, but politicians like Bill Weld, like AOC, like Hank Johnson, use these comparisons inappropriately, I think they lose all power. And once the comparison to a Nazi loses all power, there is no legacy of never forget.
Okay, I think that's a very strong point, and I think you've got a really sound argument there, and that certainly is a risk of flippant Nazi comparisons. That eventually it's a boy who cried wolf type of scenario. That eventually it's just like one way or the other. Either it starts to exactly as you said. I think there's a strong argument to that. But I would say, and I really appreciate you being consistent on this. This is actually one of the reasons, if you remember on Twitter, this was kind of the first thing I asked, and then when you answered this, in my opinion, in the correct way, I was interested to have the conversation, because I just wanted to make sure that you were consistent on this, that because there are so many people, and I got to say this really bothers me, and I'd imagine that this might bother you as well, Rabbi, that when so all of these people who do make Nazi comparisons all the time are jumping on the Libertarian Party of Kentucky for the nerve of making Nazi comparisons. It's almost to me as if they're claiming this monopoly on when it is appropriate and isn't appropriate, and they're applying it to, like I was arguing with this one Catholic woman on Twitter, nothing against Catholic women, of course, but she's lecturing me about when it's appropriate and not appropriate to make, because she had said it was so horrible what the LP of Kentucky said. Then people start sending in the screenshots of her comparing Trump rallies to Nazi rallies, Trump's immigration policy to Nazi policies, all of this. So I find that particularly outrageous for
Absolutely.
Somebody else to say, oh no, we only when it suits our political interests are we allowed to make these comparisons. And again, so I appreciate that, because even I know Nick Sarwark is the reason we're having this conversation, and I appreciate him suggesting that we do this. I really do. But even he was arguing with me that it was okay for Bill Weld and Gary Johnson to do that because the immigration policy was rounding people up, and therefore that is comparable to the Nazi regime. And my thing to that was just like, well, no, if that's okay to compare to Nazis, then I think this is too. Like, you have to be consistent one way or the other. So I would say,
because we spoke about it, Bill Weld's comparison was a little more direct. He compared it to Kristallnacht, which was the worst pogrom in European history, with 10,000 people arrested, many of them who eventually died, hundreds dead that day, and billions of dollars of damage. So I don't think the comparison held up at all. While I agree that he was fighting against something that was very noble, I don't think the argument held up. And by the way, I would note that one of the most prominent, it pains me to say that there are people on Twitter more prominent than myself, but one of the most famous names who immediately lashed out in a very vulgar way at the Libertarian Party's post himself has engaged numerous times in Nazi comparisons inappropriately, and I've called him out for it. And he is a member of the Jewish community. So I believe I'm quite consistent on this. Lubavitcher Rebbe, who's both my personal mentor and one of the foremost leaders of World Judaism in the modern era, continuously spoke about because of Nazi Germany, that we learn from Nazi Germany, which was at the time unquestionably the most educated, the most cultured country in the world. It was the country of music and art and Nobel Prize winners, etc. And they committed the most vile acts in human history, or in modern human history, let's say, because there's a bunch of bad chapters. But in modern history, when we look at that, it calls for a need for not only education, but moral education. So I think there's two aspects of why I wanted to join this conversation today. Number one, to express what the differences are between the Holocaust and this passport. And when I reached out to the Libertarian Party of Kentucky, which I did, I offered to come in for an hour and kind of share my perspective on the differences. Because again, I want them to be able to make that argument in a productive way. I think everyone's argument adds to the conversation. And the other thing is to acknowledge the morality of the argument. And I think that in a lot of the comments you saw in response to our conversation, even, including the announcement that we were going to have this conversation, lacked any sort of grace morals, etc. And again, Holocaust jokes, yellow stars, which if the posts weren't, again, anti-Semitic in intent, they certainly were in effect. And hateful anti-Semitic comments, both messaged to me, sent to me, that again, pogroms should happen.
Yeah,
I lost the majority of my family in pogroms.
Well, let me just say, I think that that's awful. That people would send that to you, and just so I publicly say that it's just that's disgusting to do, and people really shouldn't be doing that, and that also it's just particularly inappropriate to be sending that to a rabbi who's engaging in good faith in this conversation. My rule of thumb with the Twitter stuff is just in general, like. And I have a decent amount of followers there, so I get the stuff every day, like just flooded every single day with all of this stuff. I just try to focus on the positives, and the truth is that I saw when I had first responded that I was open to having the conversation, and you agreed. I saw a lot of people who were like, "Oh, that's really great," because this could be like a good faith conversation. So I agree with you that there's just
and I believe it was.
Yes, no, I completely agree, and so I think that there's a whole lot of just garbage on social media, but there's also this weird thing, and maybe it speaks to something of that same type of the human condition that we were speaking of how the most educated, advanced, industrialized society could become so evil that you put people in this situation where they're not in front of someone's face. They're just operating in front of a computer. Oftentimes their face isn't there. Their name isn't there. It's this complete freedom from consequences. And sometimes some real nasty things come out. And this is true across the political spectrum. I mean, this is true for groups on the left, groups on the right, libertarians, non-political, people. And so, yeah, it is. That stuff is really unfortunate.
So I want to touch on one thing back to what you were saying earlier, Rabbi, because I think it's really, really important to talk about how dangerous the boy who cried wolf thing is with this. Because I'm completely in agreement with both of you. But you very more than once used the words like consistently or words similar to the LP's use of this comparison, which is where I think is where you start to lose your factual basis for who's at fault here, because there's one group of people within the LP who is backing up this tweet, which is one tweet. And yes, I will agree that Twitter itself is kind of toxic and has posted other bad things in the past. And has
a rightful claim to representing a voice in the Libertarian Party.
Right. It also only has 4,000 followers on Twitter, and we're
not the biggest state.
Right. So it was still, we're talking about one tweet specifically, where in comparison to a group of people who uses this comparison every single day. Dave Smith gets called a Nazi every single fucking day. I get called a Nazi almost every day. There's some days where I don't, but it's mostly every single day. Somebody calls me either a Nazi or Nazi supporter or some form of comparison.
And a lot of those same people are the ones who are outraged by the Libertarian
Party.
They are
the exact same people. They are not some of. It is the exact same group of people. The people who are criticizing LP Kentucky right now are the exact same people who called Dave Smith.
So I would say that I'm one of the people that's criticizing that tweet.
Okay,
and I think there are others like me,
maybe 80%,
who are consistent in their argument, which is why I think you chose to have a conversation with me rather than a random guy on Twitter who yells Nazi whenever they want and then yells the opposite whenever they want.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm glad to have this argument because I think a lot of the fools on Twitter on both sides either weaponize or defend terms and tactics depending on who is using them. I think that both Nazi tactics and the use of Nazi as a weapon is either right or wrong, no matter is who using them. My position, and I hope it's certainly the position of any moral person, that those tactics are wrong, Nazi tactics. So Nazi tactics are wrong if America would use them. They're wrong if Russia would use them. They're wrong if anyone would use them.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think there are those who are being intellectually honest in this debate. I do think it's fair to say that many of those who are intellectually dishonest are just as this intellectually dishonest tweet, in my opinion. So I understand that you might disagree with that, but I believe it's intellectually dishonest, distracted from the conversation they were trying to have, which, by the way, they'd already reposted, for example, the Justin Amash tweet we talked about and several other tweets. I think all of those arguments, which many of them were fine arguments, were overshadowed by this particular stupid tweet. So just as this intellectually dishonest tweet overcame their entire argument, so too many of my fellow travelers on this topic, on this particular post, on this particular topic, their intellectually dishonesty also undercuts my argument.
Yeah.
Well, but I would say there are those who are intellectually honest on this subject.
Yeah, well, I agree
and I think
with
I have
you.
a well-reasoned point of view for why I feel this way.
Yeah, well, listen, I do agree. I agree with both of you. I agree with David that there are a lot of people not being consistent, but I also agree with you, Rabbi Litvin, that that you are being consistent, and I really do appreciate that on this topic. The LP Kentucky tweet aside, Holocaust comparisons aside, do I wonder, like, as you said, there have been comparisons to other, pretty horrible treatment of people, and specifically Jews. And I do wonder, like my whole thing about this is that I would really love to get back on topic to what we were trying to talk about and what people like myself and Justin Amash, who were doing this without those comparisons, really wanted to sound the alarm on. And just the fact that I'd imagine it must be somewhat concerning to you that if we're going to set up this new era of the regime where those who do not get vaccinated have substantially limited freedoms from the rest of us, that this is a real threat to religious Jews who I have seen very demonized in New York, in New Jersey, in Israel, in lots of areas where it seems to all be blamed on those people who just won't get the vaccine, which does happen to have a lot of overlap with some very religious communities. And I was just curious, kind of like your thoughts on the legitimacy of the concern that we're expressing, Holocaust comparisons aside.
So you may very well consider this a cop-out, but as I said before, I'm intellectually consistent. I'm a strong believer that your politicians shouldn't tell you how to pray and your rabbi shouldn't tell you how to vote. I don't teach politics, I teach morals, and I hope that leads people to certain political decisions. I will say that you can see abundantly clear the hypocrisy of the focus, particularly, for example, in New York, that the government had on the Jewish community during COVID. And with 3 attacks in the last 24 hours on religious Jews, the only Jewish thing that de Blasio has tweeted is that he had a bagel. So it's nice that you know where I am when I do something you disagree with, but someone's trying to kill me. I'd appreciate you acknowledging where I am. The only person running for mayor in New York who has acknowledged that anything has happened is Andrew Yang. So there's about half a dozen people running for mayor of New York, none of who seem to be aware that a Jewish man, woman, and infant child were stabbed in a major park in New York yesterday. And they don't seem to care. When someone doesn't
I didn't even know that.
Yeah,
to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, I think the guy was slashed in the face. It was horrible.
The father was slashed in the face. The child, the mother had a slash along her body, and the child was also slashed.
Jeez.
And by the way, this is a family coming from the Netherlands to visit New York for the holiday. So you have someone coming from a country whose population was nearly wiped out by the Holocaust, coming to New York, which is supposed to be the beacon of liberty, and being attacked for their faith. And by the way, when papers like the New York Times or the Forward paint this as random violence, that is anti-Semitic. No different than when the the kosher shop was attacked after the attack on Charlie Hebdo place, and American politicians said it was a random attack. Mm-hmm. Negating the fact that Judaism played a primary role in these attacks is in itself anti-Semitic. It's negating the reason for those attacks. So I'm happy to call out that hypocrisy, discussing what should be the political solution or my opposite. And of course, I do have very strong feelings on most political issues, like most people, but I feel it's inappropriate for a rabbi who speaks on Jewish subjects to share those opinions.
No, that's understandable.
If you'd like to have the private conversation, I'd love to. Dave, if you ever want to get to the wrapped tefillin, it would absolutely make my day.
Okay.
Open invitation. but it is not something I talk about publicly. I think it's inappropriate.
Okay, that's
yeah.
completely understandable. I would just say, just because I do talk about these things quite openly, but I'm not a leader in the religious Jewish
Correct.
community, so I don't have those constraints. But that I think that when you have the economy being destroyed, you have crime rising and racial tensions being elevated. That is never a recipe for things to work out very well for the Jews. And,
so I will certainly say that extremism has never served the Jews well.
Yeah,
nearly every extremist government has ended up very poorly for the Jews. But again, what I do is teach morals to my students and congregants, and I certainly hope my lessons impact how they vote in the political positions they support. But I think it would be inappropriate for me to openly take a political position. I think there are many rabbis and other clergies who have done that, particularly over the last 5 years, and I think it's to the detriment of the religious community, not to their benefit.
So I want to just have a question for you, Rabbi. At what point in time, like in a hypothetical world where what Dave just said continues to happen, right? At what time are we allowed to start making the comparison? Again, exactly how much anti-Semitism, how much wearing something on your sleeve that identifies you is not okay, how much specifically attacking religious groups and rounding them up, how much of that are we supposed to allow before we can start making these comparisons?
So there are fraternities on the college campus at University of Kentucky where I'm the rabbi who wear pins to identify themselves. I think to compare that to Nazis wearing pins to identify themselves would be inappropriate. I don't think the intent is the same. When you think the intent is the same, you're fine to make that comparison. You're also perfectly okay to make a comparison. So, for example, what Bill Weld tried to do, make a specific comparison between one event in history and one thing going on now, is in theory totally fine, except that the comparison he made, he completely bungled, and I think was wildly inappropriate. Again, I think the best way to make that comparison is not on Twitter, is in a reasoned article explaining what you find different, what you find the same. So we have the term compare, when often used, is half the term of compare and contrast. If you're willing to do that, I think these aspects are the same, and it's something that's alarming. That's one thing. It is extremely difficult to compare and contrast things, again, in 240 characters. So for example, Deborah Lipstadt spoke out on some of the rhetoric that Trump used, some of the rhetoric that Jeremy Corbyn used in England, and compared it to some of the rhetoric that was used by Julia Streicher and Joseph Goebbels. But she wrote it so she's a famous Holocaust historian. She wrote it in a long form article and explained both that she was specifying what she was making the comparison to and how that comparison added up. There's no issue with that. And you don't have to be a Holocaust historian to do so. But again, if you're going to use what I think we can agree was one of the worst events in human history as your counterweight, the other side better hold up, or you have a reasoned argument of why you needed to use that emotional argument. Otherwise, you're just making an emotional debate on the graves of my ancestors, which I find wildly inappropriate and against the Jewish community.
So, okay, so I think that's really interesting and a really fair point. So if, by the way, the other thing, which I didn't even bring up because I was going to let this go, but the Libertarian Party of Kentucky also messed up the analogy. I think they said they would use the vaccine.
They admitted in their follow-up
as a yellow star, where you were like, well, I mean, if you're going to do this analogy, then the yellow star would be on the non-vaccinated people, not on those. But anyway,
the analogy should have been to armbands.
Well, perhaps, but
would have been more accurate.
The yellow stars ended up being on the jacket. It's like they kept in Nazi Germany. They kept like deciding what mark the Jews had to wear. I think the marking started with like an armband in 1939, and then
I meant the Nazi armband.
Oh yeah,
would have been a more accurate.
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying. So perhaps I'm just curious how you would feel about this, Rabbi, if there had been a more reasoned, lengthy, kind of comparison where there was also the contrasting aspect. So if somebody had said in a more thought out argument, had said, look, obviously this is different from the Nazi regime in the fact that this is not, there are no genocidal intentions that have been already publicly spoken about. People are not being targeted for their religion or their race, ethnicity, however you want to look at it. People are not, there's no talk of death camps, and there aren't these kind of other factors that are in there. However, you know, the idea of marking one group of people with a certain mark that then gives them less rights than the rest of people is eerily similar to what the Nazis did to the Jews. If it was put in the proper context like that, where there was the contrasting element between, well, here's obviously what's different about it, but we still find it pretty creepy that we would be doing anything that's remotely similar to what they did, would that be less offensive to you?
It would certainly be less offensive, and I would say that would have to wait until we know more about what this proposition is. So to make that intellectual argument honest, you'd have to know more about what the proposal is in order to be able to compare and contrast them. But yes, the Holocaust is not a word you're not allowed to use. By the way, something we didn't really touch on, but another danger of constant Holocaust comparisons is there are things going on in the world right now which bear similarities to aspects of the Holocaust. For example, the actions of the Chinese government right now. Many of their actions bear eerie similarities to the actions of the Nazi government. I wouldn't compare that to the Holocaust directly, but there's an intellectual argument to be made there. But again, when everything is the Nazis, Nazi doesn't mean anything. Right. I posted 4 newspaper headlines in 2016. One that said, Trump is Hitler, basically, I phrased it differently. One that said, from a pro-Bernie point of view, that there's no difference between Hillary and Trump. One from a Republican point of view that said there's no difference between Hillary and Bernie. And the obvious conclusion is that Bernie's the same as Hitler, because if A equals B and B equals C and C equals, you know. So it's such a ridiculous argument to make, to name the leader of a major party in America to the worst figure in history. Now, I get it. You want to make an emotional argument. You want to get people riled up. But the reason they're getting riled up is the collective trauma of the Jewish community, is the fact the Jewish community is still not the same size today it was when the Holocaust started. And when that's where you're starting your argument, you have to acknowledge it's an offensive place to start an argument.
Yeah, but I mean, I think to be completely fair, it's not the Jews don't have a complete monopoly on the traumatic events of the Nazi Germany. I mean, the Nazis killed a lot of other people, not just Jews. You know, I mean, there certainly.
So while the Holocaust was a term specifically composed because it was a new term, as was genocide, to describe the treatment of the Jews, there were certainly many others who suffered tremendously under Nazi Germany, including as varied as Polish people, English people, and then all the other ones who were transferred into camps, from communists to other political adversaries, etc. The Romani community. So, which, by the way, the connection to the Romani and the Aryan community is so overlapped that it's hysterical. The Aryans felt they had a racial purity argument against them.
They weren't always perfectly rational, those Nazis.
What? Those guys? So I think that, yes, the argument could be made. Again, I would suggest to never make it on Twitter. Twitter is a wrong place to make that argument, and that to research the thing first. And again, you run into, so a large part of my issues, and you might have seen the later tweets I mentioned where I specifically mentioned is it pronounced Mises? Mises. I would note that just because it's named for a Jewish person doesn't mean that it can't be anti-Semitic. Karl Marx was Jewish, and Marxism has been one of the most anti-Semitic movements in history, not to compare the two movements.
Sure. Okay. No, I agree with you that it doesn't.
That alone doesn't solve it.
No, it doesn't solve it alone, but it might indicate.
Who were tagging Mises' post and had Mises written in. So a lot of the people I interacted with, as you said, don't have the bravery to use their own names and are calling themselves various silly, childlike handles as they're trying to have an adult conversation, which I think is counterproductive. But a lot of the comments surrounding it, so both from the Libertarian Party of Kentucky's perspective, the Rothschild quote and other Holocaust comparisons they made in the past, and a lot of the comments from people identifying publicly on Twitter as libertarians and using libertarian or NODA or Mises in their profile name, just openly engaging in anti-Semitism.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh at that, but the fact that you just identified
Noda
Noda as Mises as an out
no,
somewhat
so I'm not
outsider.
saying they're the same thing.
No, it's funny to us as insiders to the party that you looking at the party on Twitter can like put those two things together. It's just really
So
amusing
that was
to me.
just
That's
people
why
that
I
are
laugh.
using not their own name, but represent
Yes.
sections of the party. And there is a section of the party that Noda represents. It's not the same section, but there are those who voted that as a protest, etc. Now, again, that account doesn't necessarily represent those people, but they claim to. That's the name they're using. They're claiming to represent a significant portion of the party. And when you don't have, which you did have here eventually, prominent voices speaking out against the tweet itself. But I think almost the outcry surrounding the tweet was even more problematic than the tweet itself.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's I think part of the dynamic that's at work there, and it's something that's frustrating to me. And like I said, believe me, I get it just all the time on Twitter myself too, including some, really, vile anti-Semitic stuff from like crazy hard right wingers, and then I get a lot of like Nazi accusations from crazy left wingers. I mean, I get, all of it. But there's something where, so like I'm a stand-up comedian, and I'm the world that I operate in the comedy world is a very like no jokes are off limits. And that's just, and that's, I think there is something actually that overlaps with Jewish culture about that. My grandfather, who we mentioned earlier today, was very into dark humor, and it's always kind of been in my family. And specifically Holocaust jokes, which he was not, he was a fan of. And I think in some ways that was a coping mechanism for him. But so like to me, right, people know me, and I have this one account who's like they're big fans of mine. They've been listening to my show forever, and I said something the other day where I was like I forget what it was. It was something where Joe Biden promised to end the war in Afghanistan by the year 2015 when he was vice president. And I said, and you can take, I retweeted it from 2014. And I said, and you can take that to the bank. Like, we'll be out of the war. And, obviously it was not true. And then this guy who's a fan of mine, who I know his Twitter handle for years, he goes, it's always banks with you people. Now, this was completely lighthearted and not meant in, you know what I mean? Like, he knows that I'm a stand-up comedian and I joke around and this is my sense of humor. So it's almost kind of like he knows me, so that's okay. But something like that, like when a rabbi, a religious leader in the community is coming out and like having a conversation with someone, and then someone will respond with that energy, even when it's just like a joke and it's not necessarily intended, it's like I want to slap these people and be like, guys, this is just not the appropriate time, and there's like kind of no sense of that on Twitter sometimes. Like if I was in a comedy club, I mean, I think they're legal again now, so I can go back to them. But like if you're in a comedy club,
you better
and
check the list before you go.
Yeah, that's right. But if you're at a comedy club and you make a crack at a nightclub for jokes, that's different than something you'd say at a funeral. Like there's just different times.
So I put it very simple. If you're on a podcast and Big J makes a joke about the Holocaust,
there we go.
Holocaust, that's very different than you being on a podcast and David, who's representing a voice within the Liberty Party, making a crack or a joke about the Holocaust. The purpose of the podcast is two different things. Again, I don't respond to every crackpot who writes on Twitter. I specifically also focus mainly on my area, where I'm the rabbi in Central Kentucky and the most prominent voice combating anti-Semitism in Kentucky. I'm blessed to have a lot of success. Another thing that I did a great deal of advocacy on, by the way, on Twitter over the last few days was those who sought to paint not only the entire Libertarian Party, but the entire Kentucky with, because this tweet is offensive, all Kentuckians are anti-Semitic, which I said again and again, you're more likely to get attacked for being Jewish in Brooklyn than you are in Lexington, where I live, that Kentucky has spoken out against the anti-Semitic BDS movement, has spoken out for Holocaust education, has spoken out and adopted the IHRA definition and condemned anti-Semitism. Kentucky is actually on the forefront of fighting anti-Semitism. So to paint this Commonwealth as anti-Semitic, I think is completely wrong. I think it's much easier to make that comparison in LA or Brooklyn or New York than it is in Kentucky. So that's another point I was making. But the fact is that when someone wants to be taken seriously, and they also are engaging in these either jokes, offhanded comments, and open minimalization, I think it's much more of a problem. So there are plenty of comedians who tell Holocaust jokes I don't have a problem with. There is a comedian in France who was actually arrested for some of the statements he made because he called for violence in his jokes. Wouldn't it be great if it happened again? I don't even think that's an attempt to be funny anymore.
That seems like outside the realm of jokes.
Correct. So I'm a big believer when it comes to comedy in Patrice O'Neill's theory that you have to let funny people try to be funny.
Oh, you know all of my people. Rabbi, I was not expecting you to pull out Big J and Patrice O'Neill in this conversation. Very good.
So it is rare that I'll be offended by a joke intending to be funny. Now, when that joke is directed at someone you don't know on Twitter, I think it's a little different.
Yeah.
And again, when you're wanting to have a serious political debate, which the vaccine passport, I think, will be a major political debate in the coming days, the first thing I have to say is just keep my people out of it. Keep my collective trauma out of it, and keep historical revisionism out of it. Have the debate, absolutely. But again, I don't think the Libertarian Party of Kentucky's Twitter proudly said that, our tweet was viral and it helped start a conversation. Yeah, but it didn't help to start a conversation that is useful to anyone.
Well,
that is beneficial.
I'm still optimistic that we can get back to that conversation that was useful. But I
think we can. But I think the way to get back to the conversation is more conversations like this, to explain the issues, to allow everyone to understand the other side's perspective, and then go back to what we were talking about.
Well, at the risk of being a smartass, the Kentucky Party tweet is what started this conversation, and I do think it was a useful one. But that's kind of
so. Again, it started a great detour that ended up back here. But I don't think the last 3 days had to be a conversation about Holocaust revisionism. It could have been a conversation about what they wanted to talk about. So while this is a great conversation, I think you would certainly feel that this conversation is not nearly as important as the conversation we need to be having on vaccine passports. Would that be a
Yes, I agree, and I think that part of the reason why I was interested to have this conversation is that so we could deal with some of these issues, come to some common understanding, maybe not agree on every single point, but understand where each other are coming from, and then move back to the conversation that I really wanted to have, which was about how freaking dangerous I think this next phase of the COVID regime is. And
by the way, when I reached out to the Libertarian Party of Kentucky, I openly told that to them, that if you want to get back to the conversation, it's worth engaging in some way with the Jewish community. It's worth having that conversation, because just spinning your wheels about this, again, I'm happy to have the conversation on anti-Semitism in America today, on Holocaust revisionism, etc. But I don't think it benefits anyone in the Libertarian Party to have this conversation now when there's a pressing issue that is, I think, on the mind of everyone in the Libertarian Party, regardless of which faction they're in.
Well, I would say, and I know that you won't comment on the politics of it, but I will say that I think that the biggest enemy of Jewish people in human history has always been state tyranny and authoritarianism of one flavor or another, and that the libertarian philosophy is really what all people, but Jews in particular, who have disproportionately suffered the brunt of a lot of state authoritarian policies in the past, what they particularly would benefit the most from, and that also the unbelievable contributions that have been made by Jewish thinkers to the philosophy of libertarianism. I mean, it's unbelievably disproportionate how much influence Jewish thinkers have had in the school of thought. And so the idea that anybody whose worldview is shaped by this philosophy could have any type of hatred toward Jewish people just seems bonkers to me.
So again, there are Jewish thinkers that have led anti-Semitic movements.
Oh yes, no, I'm not saying
that one of the most famous representations of Jews in America, although it's filled with anti-Semitic tropes and I think it's trash, is Fiddler on the Roof. And there's a famous line in Fiddler on the Roof: "What's the blessing for the Tsar?" And he lifts his cup and says, "May God keep the Tsar far, far away from me." That line is not very far from the government that governs best governs least. So that certainly is a concept that many Jews believe in. Yeah. I also think that if the Libertarian Party wants to welcome more Jews in, as David mentioned, that his particular chapter of the party has many Jews, avoiding silly conversations like this would be a goal.
Yeah, I definitely want to thank you, because I did, after Nick tagged you into the conversation and we started talking, I went back through and I was just curious, what part of the conversation you had played. And I didn't spend very much time on Twitter at all yesterday, but just scrolled through and I did see you defending the Libertarian Party. And so I want to thank you for that, because to try to paint all of us as something because of a single tweet from a single again, I cannot stress how like the fact that they had under 4,000 followers when they sent that tweet. Like, they're not some like big name. I do understand that it's an official state account, but that doesn't mean much. If you know much about the Libertarian Party, if it was like the California state account, that'd be different. They have
so to someone from the outside, any party, any account that has the right to use official party logos, official party names, etc., seems like it does speak to the party, which is why it's so important. And what I appreciated Nick was doing was tagging and encouraging prominent voices in the movement to condemn the argument that was made here.
Yeah.
And so if I can kind of tap a few people here, those who were hesitant again, I'm fine with this tweet and let's move on, I think did a disservice to actually moving on from the tweet rather than engaging in it for at least a moment, and then allowing to actually move on to the conversation. Because saying the tweet's fine and the point of the tweet was this, ignore the rest, that's just not the way human conversation works.
Well, I think certainly that was the goal. That was my goal in having this conversation. And
your goal was to address this aspect and then put it aside and move on.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
That's much more how a conversation works than just ignore the man behind the mirror. Just focus on the part I want you to focus on.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's what I was trying to express. Yes, and I also would like to thank Nick Sarwark for setting this up and encouraging us to have this conversation. I really do think it was a productive one, and I really appreciate your time, Rabbi, and I appreciate that you came to this with a consistent view and in good faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. Well, guys, I think we kind of I think we talked it out. I think we kind of there's a little bit of agree to disagree, I think, going forward, but
I think Dave and I can have a whole nother conversation on whether his view on interviewing certain people is correct, but my view is on that. I think we certainly disagree there, but
I would love to.
He expressed what his view was, which is different than how many people paint those conversations. Right. So I respect that what his intentions were. And I think there were many parts of the conversation, I think ideas that you haven't heard made before, arguments you haven't heard made before on this subject. But okay. Yeah, I have Passover to celebrate. So
happy Passover.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation. Everybody, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and then go follow the Good Rabbi and Dave on Twitter. Have been scrolling across the bottom the entire time. But we'll catch you back here next time.